Welcome back to the second day of the symposium, Institutional Psychotherapy, Legacy and Constellations of Francesc Toscayes. In this fourth and final panel of the symposium, entitled From Occupational Therapy to Disability Art, introduced and moderated by Emily Watlington, we'll hear from Susan Hudson, Barbara Rodriguez-Munoz, and Amanda Caccia. Speakers will trace reverberations of Toscayes' institutional psychotherapy in therapeutic, reparative, and accessible art programs developed in Europe and in the United States from the 30s to today. As a quick reminder, closed captioning is available by activating the CC button at the bottom of your screen. And again, there will be time for Q&A with everyone at the end of the panel. So please share your questions for our speaker throughout the talk and using the Q&A feature or the chat. And now I'll hand it over to Emily Watlington. Emily Watlington is an art critic and senior editor at Art in America. Please, a warm welcome to Emily. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Mathilde, and thanks everyone for joining. I thought before I introduce our panelists, I would just quickly sort of explain, my allegiances and my background, which is going to, inform my questions later. So I'm a critic, I'm not a historian, and I'm very much involved in disability arts and in disability justice as they're unfolding right now. And in those realms, there's this widespread skepticism regarding the ways that disabled people get medicalized and also more specifically aren't seen as capable of telling our own stories. And I believe Amanda Caccia is going to speak to that in this panel. And there's a lot about this current disability arts movement that's artist-led and that I'm trying to, chronicle and make visible through my position at Art in America. So our October 2022 issue is dedicated to disability culture, and it's a topic I'm covering somewhat regularly. And what I'm trying to do in part is articulate and give language to the movements and trends and disagreements and ideas as they're unfolding right now in a manner that I hope is understandable and engaging to a wide audience. So with that in mind, I wanted to start by just introducing one more contemporary term born from this movement that I think will be helpful and relevant, and then I'll introduce our panelists. And so that term is disability culture, which David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder write about in their 2015 book, Biopolitics of Disability. It's, of course, been written about elsewhere as well, but there's a quote I really like from this book. So they're lamenting the fact that so much of disability studies, especially at that point, focus on access and inclusion, but they write that, quote, disability subjectivities are not just characterized by socially imposed restrictions, but in fact, productively create new forms of embodied knowledge and collective consciousness, end quote. So they're very much responding to a contemporary American environment. And what they're saying is that disability is often inherently a creative force, right? You have to innovate new ways to do things when you're interacting in a world that's not built to accommodate you. And for this reason, impairment isn't just a lack or a deficit. And from this creativity, as well as from the webs of interdependence formed in disabled community, a new culture is born. And so I'll just quickly describe what's on my screen before introducing the panelists. So I'm not showing slides. You see me and Emily. I'm a white woman with like armpit length curly brownish blondish hair. I'm wearing a orange button up and some gold glasses. I'm in a New York apartment with tragically blank walls. I just moved, and there's a window behind me that in New York apartment style looks onto a brick wall. So I'll start by introducing Amanda Caccia. Amanda is a curator, consultant, writer, and art historian who specializes in disability art activism across intersectional axes of difference, including gender, race, and sexuality. She's a tenure-track assistant professor and the assistant director of the Masters of Arts and Arts Leadership graduate program at the Catherine G. McGovern College of the Arts at the University of Houston. There, she also serves as the coordinator of the graduate certificate in museum and gallery management, as well as the graduate certificate in arts and health. She's a 2023 grantee of the Creative Capital Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grants, congratulations, for her second monograph, which I believe she's presenting on today. It's called Hospital Aesthetics, Rescribing Medical Images of Disability. And her first book, The Agency of Access, Contemporary Disability Art and Institutional Critique, is forthcoming with Temple University Press this year. Katya is also the editor of Curating Access, Disability Art Activism, and Creative Accommodation from 2022 from Routledge. And that book includes over 40 international contributors. She has a PhD in art history, theory, and criticism from the University of California, San Diego, and has curated approximately 50 exhibitions, many of which have traveled to cities across the US, England, Australia, and Canada. She previously taught art history, visual culture, and curatorial studies at such schools as the Otis College of Art and Design, California Institute of the Arts, California State University Long Beach, California State University San Marcos, and San Diego State University. Our next panelist is Suzanne Hudson, who received her PhD from Princeton and is currently professor of art history and fine arts at the University of Southern California. She's an art historian and critic who writes on modern and contemporary art. Her research spans the 19th through 21st centuries, with special emphasis on the history, theory, and conventions of painting within art schools and alternative pedagogical institutions, which includes spaces of care work and medical and psychological services, subject of today's talk. She's a co-founder of the Contemporary Art Think Tank and the Society of Contemporary Art Historians, an affiliate society of the College Art Association, and she's a recent member of the editorial board of CAA Reviews and the advisory board of the Archives of American Art Journal. Hudson's work has been supported by the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, Creative Capital, the Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, and the Daedalus Foundation, among others. A regular contributor to Art Forum since 2004, she's also written numerous essays for international exhibition catalogs and artist monographs. She's the author of several books, including Robert Ryman Used Paint from MIT Press in 2009, I believe. Agnes Martin, Night Sea from After All, MIT Press 2017, and Contemporary Painting, Thames and Hudson in the World of Art series 2021. She's also the co-editor of Contemporary Art 1989 to Present from Wiley Blackwell in 2013. And Modernism Art Therapy is forthcoming from Yale University Press. Supported by a New Directions Fellowship from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, she is pursuing research into the practical applications of art making for her book, Better Making, Art Therapy Process, a study of the therapeutic origins of process within American modernism. Lastly, Barbara Rodriguez Munoz is a curator and a researcher. Since 2021, she's also the director of exhibitions at the collection at Centro Botín in Santander, Spain, where she has curated exhibitions of artists such as Ellen Gallagher, Ronnie Horn, Ava Fabregas, Shilpa Gupta, and Sylvia Bachley. From 2014 until 22, she was a curator at Wellcome Collection London, where she developed an artistic program on the politics of health and ecology, including a few exhibitions she's going to speak about today, like Bedlam from 2016, and Joe Spence and Orsit Ashry, Misbehaving Bodies in 2019. Most recently, she was one of several curators behind the Yoi Care, Repair, Heal at Gropiusbau in Berlin that opened in 2022. And Barbara's guest editor of Health, Documents of Contemporary Art, which was co-published by the MIT Press and Whitechapel, as well as Concreta 19 on Deep Time. She's written for After All, Art Agenda, Concreta, Les Laboratoires de Aubervilliers, Gwangju Biennale, Marg, and Moose. She has also been a guest lecturer at Goldsmiths, London College of Communications, and Central St. Martin's. She holds a master in curating contemporary art from the Royal College of Art in London. We are starting with Suzanne.
Thank you so much, Emily, and to Mathilde and Richard, who I'm hoping can, oh, perfect, right on cue. Thank you. I was gonna say cue the images. And I wanna thank everyone at the Folk Art Museum for facilitating this. I have not yet gotten to see the exhibition, but I look forward to doing so later in May. I also want to thank everyone who's spoken already, from whom I've learned so much, and to my co-panelists now. Look forward to the conversation to follow. So I will jump in. Oh, I'm sorry. And also absolutely last but absolutely not least, the ASL interpreters who are working with us today. So I am going to jump into this talk I've called Crafting Health. It's a very different cast of characters in the US context than what we have been exploring in the last panels. So without further ado, I will introduce them. Okay, so to the question of what is occupational therapy, the current website for the American Occupational Therapy Association, from now on I will be just referring to it as AOTA, supplies this answer, quote, "Occupational therapy enables people of all ages to participate in daily living." Thus does the association claim what its work does, rather than defining what occupational therapy is. And in this move from ontology, it importantly betrays a century of practice that necessarily remained responsive to shifting populations and sites of application as a primary condition of its visibility, and I would say also its viability. This is true despite early and sustained efforts at codification through standardized training, among other professionalizing objectives, within a series of restructurings of education, licensure, and reimbursement within the medical field more broadly. Occupational therapy emerged as an allied health profession in the United States by World War I. And Richard, if you don't mind moving to the first image. With newly minted reconstruction aids tending to the battle wounded and infirm. And if you could go ahead, one more to see the work that they were actually doing. Thank you. Inspired by the arts and crafts movement as mediated through settlement houses, practitioners stressed the therapeutic value of handicrafts and manual work, even if they differed over who had a right to facilitate it. So the question, and I'll outline some of this in what follows, was whether this was the purview of nurses or teachers with skills in crafts. They promoted the idea that such engagement could contribute to rehabilitation and overall well-being, and on such grounds urged its broader assimilation as ancillary clinical care. But as with the limits of progressive reform more broadly, its appealing to non-alienated production existed within the structures of harm that it ultimately prepared its subjects less to change than to functionally endure. So in what follows, I will pose questions of labor, process, and product, suggesting that the institutionalization of the therapeutic value of meaningful work within healthcare settings in the United States was differently understood by the early 1940s, a period when debates around compensation for occupational therapists' own labor, together with objects made under supervisory conditions, likewise assumed new significance in the clinic, but also the modern museum. So, to get started, early occupational therapy curricula and textbooks conceived by Susan Tracy and William Rush Dunton Jr. in 1910 and 1915, respectively, were oriented to training nurses. This was something that the Chicago School of Civics and Philanthropy took on as well in instructing nurses how to provide patients with, quote, handicraft, exercise, and play. For his part, George Barton was duly inspired by Dr. Herbert Hall, who used his own workshop in Marblehead, Massachusetts, as an experiment in occupational instruction by craftspeople. And if I may have the next slide. Barton formed Consolation House at the Clifton Springs Sanitarium. It was there in 1917 that Barton invited psychiatrist William Rush Dunton, Thomas B. Kidner, the Commissioner of Canadian Military Hospitals, and social worker and occupational therapist associated with Hull House, Eleanor Clark Slagle, among others, to form the Society for the Promotion of Occupational Therapy. Already by 1922, the Professional Archives of Occupational Therapy became the official organ of the renamed American Occupational Therapy Association. OT's development alongside and then embarkation within medical settings was not inevitable, but rather something managed and achieved, however, I suppose tenuously. When Tracy, the nurse teaching nurses, published her textbook, and may we advance to the next, Studies in Invalid Occupations, a manual for nurses and attendants, the Journal of the American Medical Association reviewed it right away, noting, quote, "Although this book is not directly medical, it is of interest to physicians and to all who have to do with invalids. Practically every sort of work that may be employed to pass the tedious time of persons crippled or otherwise shut in has been explained and illustrated here," end quote. A forthright argument for the utility of the approach for inpatient populations is mounted too within the book's introduction by Daniel Fuller, MD, Tracy's collaborator. He includes occupation in his summary of fads, quote, "Massage, electricity, gymnastics, dietary regimes, hydrotherapy, the use of light, heat, and fresh air, occupations, instructions and methods of self-help, and ways of using suggestion or psychotherapy," end quote. But he singled out occupation alone, quote, "not as a panacea, but as an important adjunct to the other forms of treatment, and sometimes is quite all the treatment necessary," end quote. Tracy derived her own framework from John Dewey, who wrote in The School and Society, quote, "By occupation is not meant any kind of busy work or exercise that may be given to the child to keep him out of mischief or idleness when seated at his desk. By occupation, I mean a mode of activity on the part of the child, which reproduces or runs parallel to some form of work carried on in the social life. The fundamental point in the psychology of an occupation is that it maintains a balance between the intellectual and the practical phases of experience," end quote. Studies in invalid occupations outlines the benefits of occupational participation in treatment for children and adults, and suggests projects that might be used for different categories of invalids. And here I would note the organizing premise of the deductive structure, a response predicated upon fitting the intended work into the problem, more so than working to contradict or more radically dismantle the structure in which the problem arises. Thus could these care settings be construed as spaces of active pedagogy, in which self-interested learning was presided over by an authority who still encouraged the individual to play an active role, but now this role was applied to one's healing, even or especially if through skills-based instruction. If idleness was the problem in the classroom or the clinic, and Hall, for his part, claimed as much, writing, quote, "Idleness too long continued is as deadening to the spirit as it is to the body. It often means degeneration and in the end, increased suffering." Work was posed as the remedy. Indeed, Hall coined the quote-unquote work cure, but versions of the same are the common denominator among these early advocates. And may we please have the next image. Hall recommended the use of manual work because it is quote-unquote wholesome and developmental and may be in itself a curative agent. He further recommended dividing, quote, the 24 hours into changeable periods of work, rest, and recreation, plenty of air, wholesome food, wise suggestions, and such medical treatment as may be indicated, end quote. In this, the work cure contradicts and means to supplant the rest cure, as Weir Mitchell's earlier response to an epidemic of nervous diseases. He advocated that the mentally frail, conspicuously gendered patient stay isolated in bed, subject to somatic interventions. Mitchell intended to renovate the quote-unquote sickly, feeble, wasted creature who was rendered incapable of performing her duties into, quote, a handsome, wholesome, helpful woman, end quote, not least through a prohibition on her engaging in meaningful activities like reading or writing. Jane Thrailkill argues that, quote, infantilization was often a symptom of nervous disease, but was not for Mitchell a therapeutic end. The point of the rest cure was to restore a woman to adulthood, end quote. This means that the treatment aimed to return the subject to rightfully circumscribed productivity, but productivity still, to bear the burden of domestic maternal labor, of caretaking for others' absent prestige, not to abdicate responsibility for doing it. In some fundamental ways, then, whether through rest or work, the goal remained the facilitation of a capable laborer, not least a generation of malaise-stricken invalid girls, nurses who became occupational therapists, who found for themselves the ameliorations of work. As feminist historians following Elaine Showalter have noted, the bouts of sickness and this and invalid girls are very much in scare quotes here, and depression that they experienced after graduation characterized the first generation of college women. For his part, Barton extended this work cure into modes of economic profitability, moving seamlessly from personal meaning to market evaluation and social utility based therein. He prods, quote, "Try to prove that the hours of idleness can be filled happily with pastimes which shall be useful, and prepare him for remunerative labor later." He furthered that subjects need, quote, "a job, a better job, or a job done better than it was before." As Kathleen Reed recently summarized, quote, "The result would be clients who would retain or regain their role as productive individuals after hospitalization, instead of depending on others for care and financial assistance," end quote. Thus did the elevation of the products of occupational therapy come to matter beyond their status as sorts of transitional objects in a trajectory of refunctioning. The skills learned to make a basket or a rug, a pot or a bound book, might, after serving their occupational purposes, become pre-vocational training. Even if not, the objects might be sold. And I want to pause here actually to say that I think this is an interesting case study in that it's quite different from extractive models of outsider art in which the maker does not necessarily consent to the exhibition or sale of their work. And instead, in these early occupational therapy discourses and practices, it was very much part of a language of self-determination and a kind of a direct appeal to financial solvency as part of what the work cure was meant to provide. So the place of economically remunerative labor and the conceptions of invalidism and ability that underpin it loom large in OT's founding documents and early archive. Nevertheless, these questions were forced ever more urgently in the 1930s. And may we have the next image, please? When the newly installed President Roosevelt set forth his Economy Act of 1933, attempting to reduce the country's federal deficit by cutting the salaries of federal workers and reducing benefit payments to veterans. And these benefits, for our purposes today, were importantly inclusive of occupational therapy, physical therapy, and services rendered by dietitians. This left the AOTA lobbying for roles, subordinating ties to craft work, or at least offering it alongside other job-oriented competencies, including agriculture, woodworking, and piano tuning, which I should note were also part of earlier World War I era responses and were kind of reactivated in the 1930s. Occupational therapy, hence its opportunism relative to population scale disruptions to the workforce, acted against invalidism, understood as a drain on familial or custodial, which is also to say governmental resources. The presumptive goals of rehabilitation were the habituation to productive life, recognizing solvency as one such critical dimension, crucially for the practitioners, overwhelmingly women, as much as for their clients. And it turned out that their lobbying worked. By 1939, the therapist Edith Stern could boast in a promotional essay explaining the work cure that, quote, "Occupational therapy is one of the few professions that has no unemployment problem. The demand for trained workers still far exceeds the supply," end quote. This owed much to a broadening of the conception of occupation, what the AOTA frames in its own survey of its history as a kind of preservative move, quote, "A drastic shift from simply utilizing arts and crafts to using activities of daily living in the treatment of a variety of conditions," end quote. I would argue, too, that it was at this moment of pragmatic refunctioning of the field that the materials of occupational therapy became visible as a category of product, effectively advertising the profession that facilitated them. And may we have the next image? By 1933, the AOTA became affiliated with the American Medical Association Council to encourage OT education, educational standards, and to participate in conferences with the American Hospital Association, one of which you see here. These conferences set the work of occupational therapy alongside that supported by other companies rendering services and products. One kind of amazing historical discovery was that the Philip Morris and Company representative was, quote, "happy to discuss researches and problems on the physiological effects of smoking." At any rate, beyond exhibitions and trade shows and care facilities, the war effort provided a new context that became a platform for the exhibition of this work, meaning that of the occupational therapists as well as that of their clients in the modern museum. And may we have the next. Thank you. James Strahl Sobey, director of the Museum of Modern Art's Armed Services Program, a collaboration between government agencies and the museum, operative from 1942 to 1945, was a central figure in this institutionalization. The museum's wartime agenda encompassed 38 contracts for various governmental agencies, including the Office of War Information Overseas Division and the Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, headed by Nelson Rockefeller. The Armed Services Program sent patriotic materials and exhibitions to the armed services. It also erected a canteen for servicemen in the museum's garden, among other initiatives, finding an audience, or rather building one. So pervasive was the therapeutic impulse that Fred Turner could write of MoMA in the 1940s as, quote, a national hub for rethinking the use of art in the healing of wounded and traumatized soldiers. Beyond supplying materials to troops in the US Army camps, Sobey solicited projects to be used, quote, by disabled soldiers and sailors for whom occupational therapy was prescribed. Seemingly responding to suggestions by Dorothy Liebes, then working with the Red Cross, and in collaboration with Meta Cobb, Executive Secretary for AOTA, Sobey sent out a call for a juried exhibition, canvassing for fresh sources to use in occupational therapy for government hospitals. Called The Arts in Therapy, it was co-sponsored by the museum, Artists for Victory, and the AOTA, and sought, quote, designs, actual working models, and ornamental motifs for use in therapy for wounded or disabled soldiers and sailors, quote. Entries were to be made from inexpensive and easily obtainable materials and had to be something small enough to be made in bed. According to the competition guidelines, prizes were nevertheless awarded for those which were therapeutically and aesthetically most suitable. The occupational therapy selection of the resulting exhibition, which includes some of the images that you see here, which is from a MoMA bulletin that I'll mention in just a moment that Meta Cobb contributed to, but we have the exhibition installation image. Thank you. Included furniture, toys, textiles, rugs, lace, loom work, and other miscellany made by teachers and therapists as well as artists, including Louise Bourgeois, Alexander Calder, and Louise Nevelson, whose contributions were not eligible for prizes. The objects on organizing shelves were overshadowed by enlarged photographs lent to MoMA by the British Information Services, which depicted servicemen in hospitals participating in occupational therapy practices. In the museum bulletin, the image which you just saw, Sobey writes of the jurying and exhibiting, raising the quality of craft work in occupational therapy, quote, its purpose was to provide a fresh supply of designs and objects and the crafts to be utilized wherever needed by those in charge of therapeutic work for the armed forces. But we have not gathered those objects with the limited idea of offering them as models to be copied by patients. Our purpose has been broader than this. We have hoped to stimulate and strengthen the curative potentialities of the crafts by calling upon the manifestly suitable talents of American artists and craftsmen, end quote. In their own contribution to the museum bulletin, Meta Cobb and Harriet Knapp write, in the interest of the patient, the interest of the patient will be kindled through good design and sustained by the realization that he is making something of worth. Everyone agrees that the patient's interest is of immeasurable importance in effecting a cure. Another related exhibition from 1943 that Sobey likewise organized with AOTA, called Occupational Therapy, Its Function and Purpose, more forthrightly claimed as its purview, quote, the process of restoring soldiers and civilians to physical and mental health through occupational therapy, specifically prescribed for each individual case by a professional therapist, end quote. For those whose processes did yield compelling products as a byproduct of therapy, the next step was recommended pre-vocational training. May we have the next image? The museum did show veteran art made at what became the War Veterans Art Center, which they established in the wake of the Arts in Therapy and Occupational Therapy exhibitions. to sell the methods of occupational and also art therapy as they were being developed in the context of the war effort, and to publicize and celebrate the war and veteran projects at MoMA before the museum sunset them in 1948, or perhaps more accurately, wrested back the role of the art educator from the therapist, preserving in the process the emphasis on process and transforming in name but not curriculum to serve a civilian population. Tracy had earlier insisted that, quote, occupation is a means rather than an end. In the galleries at MoMA, and may I have my final slide, please? Where the outcomes of occupations might have been displayed as material ideals, they were instead presented as quote unquote accomplished, they were not presented as quote unquote accomplished products, as MoMA educator Victor D'Amico would put it, but rather, in his words, evidence of the changed lives of veterans. The story was one of subjects restored to agency, not of the manufacture of good design after all, in which the objects were consequential on their own terms. As modernist principles were folded into OT, OT reciprocally insinuated itself into the museum, if ultimately through the structural accommodation to exhibiting process, that its objects bearing witness to the transformation of lives required, now cleave from the therapeutic mandate that once engendered it. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. That was wonderful. Let's hold discussion until all of our panelists go, but if that brought up questions for you, please certainly put them in the chat and I'll make sure to incorporate them at the end. And then next we have Barbara.
Thank you very much, Matilda, and the organizers for the invitation to be part of this wonderful symposium with many researchers I admire. My presentation is titled Expression Revelation, Safer Spaces to Engage Critically and Ethically with Health Issues. I'm going to quickly describe myself. I'm a white Mediterranean woman, black hair. I'm wearing a bright pink top, and I'm in my house in Santander in the back room. So you can see at the background a futon, and behind me a Japanese textile. And now I will share my screen. So between 2012 and 2021, my research and my practice focus on the politics and aesthetics of health and access, as embodied in museum objects, artworks, and texts, and how to translate health issues for a wider audience in kinder, safer, and accessible ways. During this time, I worked for health charities developing art and health programs in art institutions like South London Gallery, museums like the Freud Museum, psychiatric hospitals like Bethlehem Royal Hospital, and mainly as a curator at Wellcome Collection in London for 9 years. And now, since 2021, I'm artistic director at Centro Botín, an art center, for the ones that don't know, located in Santander, north of Spain, so 1 hour east from Bilbao, where the program is not thematic. It doesn't revolve around health. In most cases, it's not academic or research-led. It is very much artist-led. However, my experience in working with access and effective devices for audiences, not as an afterthought, but as a generative practice that is embedded in the research process, in the administration and paperwork and contracts, in the form and presentation of artistic projects, is still very, very relevant in my work. So I just wanted to unpack what I mean when I say health, because it's a very big, loaded, abused word. I understand health as a political space, as a social space that can be divorced from the entanglements between all of us, but also between human and non-human species. This is something that many of us, and we need to remember that disabled and chronically ill people are the largest marginalized community in the world. Many of us learned in our bodies, or many of us knew this, but many of us learned this in our bodies and our lives during the pandemic. There is a very interesting book, which has been very inspiring for me, by American author Eula Bliss. It's titled On Immunity. And she talks about immunity as a garden that we tend together. And for me, health is a space that we also cultivate together. So with this, I mean that I'm not talking about health in this neoliberal, productive take. I'm not talking so much about well-being, but about challenging notions of normality, of what is considered to be a healthy, productive body, engaging with the politics of health, engaging with the politics of care. And through these years, I have aimed to create safer spaces, and I say safer and not safe, and this is on purpose, because you cannot create a safer space, you can just try to make it safer, where vulnerability can be exposed, where the private and the public collapses. And I think about how to support the artists we collaborate with and our visitors in this encounter. One of the texts that has for long been a very productive mantra when thinking about design, interpretation, atmosphere of an exhibition dealing with intimate, tabooed experiences is a paragraph by the wonderful Bell Hooks when she's writing about the work of the late Felix González Torres. Hold on, my slide. Yeah, Bell Hooks writes in Subversive Beauty, Art of My Mind, that the work of Felix González is bringing us face to face with our vulnerability, our lack of control over our bodies, our intense longing for nurturance. For example, the bits of candy in an installation we're allowed to take and suck remind us of our engagement with the wall of the senses. This art restores the primacy of our bond with flesh. It is about exposure and revelation, hence the title of the presentation. Closeness and separation. This image is a passage linking the particular losses we experience with a culture of collective grief. Once we embrace his vision of the collapse of public and private, the convergence of the individual and the collective, then we open ourselves to the possibility of communion and community. In 2020, in the midst of the pandemic, I finished editing the anthology Health, co-published by the MIT and the Whitechapel, which is a book that maps practices, positions, and theories connected to health in contemporary art. The book and my intention was to privilege and amplify personal experiences that narrate how the vulnerability of our bodies and the maladies that seize them reveal structural aspects of our societies. But these practices happening right now, there are so many artists working around the politics of health. They are not happening in a void. They're informed by feminist and queer thinking, as well as continuing the legacy of other 1970s, 80s, 90s counterculture movements, such as artistic responses to the AIDS/HIV crisis, critical psychiatry, crip theory, and the colonial practices. And what I think really emerges in the book through all these voices is the prevailing blind spot within diversity agendas in cultural programs, where health intersectionality is still neither articulator nor nurture. Institutions are still at early stages of developing curatorial and educational practices that tackle health marginalization, but I think that artists, as usual, are leading these changes. Not only making works that engage critically with health, but also through the publication and enforcement of access guidelines and access riders. And in America and the US, you have Caroline Lazard's super useful manual called Access in the Arts, a Promise and a Practice. This book gathered the research mainly for two artistic projects I developed at Wellcome Collection, which are my brief case studies for today, Bedlam and Misbehaving Bodies. Considering the topic of the symposium, I'm pretty certain that many of you know Wellcome Collection. It's a museum and a library exploring health and human experience, and it's one of the most wonderful and fascinating institutions I know. The historical collection is very interesting, but as you can imagine, deeply problematic. It was gathered by a network of collectors following colonial routes, and Henry Wellcome's instruction to capture the art and science of healing through the ages and across the world. The collection clearly reveals the patriarchal and colonial structures that were at play when the items were collected, which also persist these days. Historical collections are inherently biased. The inequalities that exist in human societies are reflected in our institutional holdings, objects, archives, taxonomies, interpretation. Museum collections often reinforce normative and binary approaches to human and non-human life, separating nature and culture, mind and body, the sick and the healthy. However, collections and the archives have an incredible potential to develop artistic programs dealing with urgent issues in relation to social and environmental justice. And this was my task during 9 years at Wellcome. A very productive term I used to think about this transhistorical exhibition-making work is a reparative taxonomy. For scholar Melissa Adler, a reparative taxonomy is one that embraces the emergence of new, buried, marginalized, and discarded knowledges with the understanding that what it means to know is always changing and contingent. I co-curated Bethlehem with historian Mike Jay, who is an expert on the history of the asylum. I'm a contemporary art curator. The design was done by MAF, who are architecture studio led by a woman based in Hackney in London, and they collaborated with mental health service users from Dragon Cafe in London. And the graphics were by Martin McGrath. The exhibition was, in a nutshell, mapping the rise and fall of the asylum, but it was very much, and following what I say about the book and my approach, centering lived experiences of people that inhabited the asylum, which were not always easy to find in historical collections, including Wellcome collection. In ancient times, the asylum was a space, often a religious sanctuary, where individuals could seek refuge. It was from these spiritual origins that modern mental asylums emerged. They became the places where Western ideas about mental health, mental illness were defined, and different approaches to treatment evolved. Bethlehem, the Asylum and Beyond combines some of these perspectives by following the story of one such institution, Bethlehem. This word became a general term for asylums, but it originally referred to the Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London, which was founded in the 13th century and still provides mental health care today. The exhibition, as I say, was focusing on the lived experiences of those who inhabited the asylums or the ones that created alternatives to them. It was juxtaposing historical material and medical records with individual testimonies and artworks that reflect or reimagine the institution both as a physical and a virtual space. Ultimately, we wanted to interrogate the original idea that the asylum represented, a place of refuge, sanctuary, and care, and ask whether and how it could be reclaimed. At the time, I was observing how contemporary artists, so let's say early 20s and the first decade, the first 2 decades, were engaging with 70s, 80s critical psychiatry. So Dora Garcia was doing work on Franco Basaglia, Luke Fowler was doing work on Ardilan, Eva Koktakova, and we see her work in this picture, Asylum, was doing research on constrained structures and was connecting educational settings with asylums. Other artists were fascinated with those scales too. So I was interested in working with some of these artists, but I was especially interested, and Mike Jay had the knowledge, in looking at alternative structures to the asylum that predate these critical psychiatry movements. We wanted historical contexts. Since the birth of the asylum's history, different ideas and approaches were created, challenged, and reinvented, by different and often opposing voices, those of doctors, patients, religious leaders, artists, social commentators, and reformers. Their experiences shaped the meaning of mental illness and created today's varied landscape of mental health care. So, for example, the York Retreat, which was opened by the Society of Friends, so the Quakers, in 1796 in response to the poor conditions of York's public asylum. It was designed to resemble a family home. Patients and staff lived together, they ate and worked together, the woman polished the furniture and churned the butter, while the men labored in the house and grounds. The regime was known as moral therapy, and many of its precepts were later adopted by 20th century therapeutic communities. Patient art was encouraged in the early 20th century in mental health hospitals for a variety of reasons, and we've been talking about occupational therapy, for developing craft skills as a tool for exploring the patient's mental world. But we wanted to go beyond the therapeutic. We were interested in the politics of patient art, to overturn hierarchies as protest, to reform, and how the so-called outsider art is part of the marketplace, commodified. And here we see a still of a film by Pia Borg and Edward Lawrenson called Abandoned Goods. It's a short essay about the extraordinary collection of artworks created by patients that were detained at Netherne Psychiatric Hospital in Surrey between 1946 and 1981. The artworks were created in a pioneering art studio in the hospital run by the artist Edward Adamson, and today it hosts around 5,500 pieces. They are assembled together as the Adamson Collection, and it's one of the major bodies of British asylum art. But they've gone through a change of status. They were transformed from the therapeutical objects in the Adamson Collection, from clinical material to revered art objects. As they entered Wellcome Collection storage in 2015, they were abandoned in the basement, and here's the title, Abandoned Goods, of the film, and now they're being preserved by conservators wearing white gloves. I'm sure you're all very familiar with Richard Dutt, amazing Victorian English painter. He was already a celebrated artist when he was institutionalized. He called him the alienist. Richard Dutt turned the patient's gaze at a time where there were so many images made by doctors or photographers of patients to classify their conditions, but Richard turns the patient gaze on the doctor with this portrait of the governor of Bethlehem. Morrison himself was an admirer of Dutt's work and owned several of his watercolors. We had these amazing textile pieces by Mary Frances Heaton, whose story is sadly very familiar for women. She was a music teacher, and she was admitted to Wakefield Asylum in 1837, suffering from epilepsy and what they considered delusions after an affair with, and I say delusions in inverted commas, after an affair with Lord Seymour, whose children were her pupils. She remained there for 36 years. She never accepted her diagnosis, and over the years, she sued intricate samplers detailing her version of events, including this letter to Queen Victoria protesting against her confinement. In 1972, the artist Ugo Guarino collaborated with the Franco Basaglia movement, the democratic psychiatry, in campaigning to close the asylums and replace them with community mental health hospitals. But here is an incredible precedent of alternatives to the structure and architecture of the asylum. In 1810, Bethlehem held a public competition to design a new hospital building. These drawings and notes were submitted by James Tilly Matthews, who had been confined in the old building as an, and inverted commas, incurable lunatic since 1797. These are the first plans of a mental health hospital that we know that are designed by a patient. In his accompanying notes, Matthews proposes that inmates should not be kept locked, but occupying growing vegetables, caring for the sick, and helping with daily routines. The mad house should become a community in which everyone has a stake. As a response, contemporary artists Hannah Hall and James Leadbeater, aka the vacuum cleaner, ran Mad Love workshops with 432 people with lived experience of mental distress in a range of settings, from high security psychiatric hospitals to activist groups. They ask, is it possible to go mad in a positive way? How would you create a safe place in which to do so? If you designed your own asylum, what would it look like? They accumulated thousands of suggestions for how an utopian mental health hospital could look and work. They created this model, this maquette, a prototype, which has been presented to NHS administrators as a research and as a proposition, and it was activated in the exhibition space by activities and conservations with audiences and mental health service users. Now, my second case study is the exhibition Misbehaving Bodies, U.S. Spence and Orit Ashby, which presented a dialogue between the late U.S. Spence and contemporary artist Orit Ashby, focusing on their work around critical responses to the representation of chronic illness, death, and dying, so all rather taboo topics. In 2015, Wellcome Collection acquired 6 works by British artist U.S. Spence to expand its art and health collection. Spence started as a documentary photographer and at some point turned the camera towards herself to explore her body, her life, her relations, and her early life experiences of illness. In one of the acquired works, we encounter the artist floating in water with her arms outstretched. It's called The Final Project, and it belongs to the artist's final project, a series of photo fantasies created after she was diagnosed with leukemia in 1991. This meditative image was printed after her death by the collaborator Terry Dennett, and it counters the artist's previously raw and confrontational works. As we contemplate this metaphorical photograph of Spence's body returning to nature, we ask, how does Spence's work claim an existence that does not conform to standardized images of the perfect life? and how does illness disrupt and shape our identity. Influential photographer Joe Spence's work was shown in dialogue with Orit Asheri's award-winning miniseries called Revisiting Genesis from 2016, which is a politically engaged work exploring loss and the lived experience of chronic illness in the digital era. So while working in different eras and media, Spence and Asheri challenged the medical gaze and looked beyond a diagnosis to form a more complex portrait of their subjects. They foreground collaborative ways of working to create a safer space where vulnerability is made visible. They take a critical approach to the representation of illness and death and present it as part of the creative texture of life. They take what is often seen in a negative light and reclaim it, misbehaving productively to undermine assumptions and question typical narrative structures. So I'm afraid we don't have time here, but I really encourage you all to watch Orit Asheri's Revisiting Genesis. It's a 12-part miniseries that won the German award, and you can find it online. It's mixing dialogue, real-life interviews with people who have life-limiting conditions, and it's exploring digital and emerging technologies of dying, Facebook accounts, so who's going to manage them when we are not here, digital wills, artist legacy online, and even an avatar for your loved ones to mourn when we are not here anymore. And it's doing this in parallel with care and feminist reincarnations of women artists. But for me, it speaks of different forms of loss, personal loss, social loss, and withdrawal as a form of protest. So it was a very heavy topic, although both Orit and Joe share a great amount of humor in their work. So we collaborated to create a space in consultation with Mackie's Center in the UK. For the ones that don't know the Mackie's Center, this is a charity that creates caring environments to provide free cancer support for patients. And the texts were written in consultation with patients, relatives, and nurses. We collaborated with Devicon Architects, Mark El Khatib as graphic designer, and Orit. And as you can see, we did everything we can to create a community space in the museum. Otherwise, the building can be quite cold and imposing. The place was intimate, playful, supportive for our visitors. There were tie-dye teddy bears with very long arms to cuddle you, soft materials to allow, like Bell Hooks says, for the private and the public to collapse. There was pleasure, access, joy. It was inhabited. It was extremely successful. You can see here my nephews and my little kid when he was a baby and playing on the teddy bear. And it was like a cocoon to view this material. And my final slide is Orit. Orit Asheri, she engaged in shaping the public programs. In the space, there was a central table with chairs that were installed with contextualizing reading material and accessible material, where we ran micro-residencies with people with lived experiences of ill health. So the space was constantly inhabited with people that could have conversations with the public. The table also hosted group discussions and workshops and was crucial for access and participation. And on this table, Asheri permanently placed the question, do you consider yourself healthy? There was a plastic box that was continuously empty and filled up with many, many written responses from the public. And these responses were read aloud publicly by actors at different points of the exhibition throughout the Wellcome Collection building. Now they've been archived and they are part of the Art and Health collection, which is great because they're counterbalancing all these doctor voices with lived experiences of people that visited the exhibition. And I'm just gonna play a little clip of these voices and finish my presentation. And I'm also gonna share, I'll play.
Physically and mentally. I'm terrified to live a world which implies that I am a burden. I don't like how I can live, and I don't ever want to impose on someone else's life and freedom. I'm scared. Yes, but I'm considering taking up smoking.
Just did.
Walking, yoga, cycling, swimming, and eating a wholesome vegetarian diet. Sure, I have some deficiencies, thyroid function, need dopamine to assist sleep, and to keep the bastard genital herpes away. But I'm healthier than most people I think I know. Top tips: swim, Walk barefoot, stimulate your feet, and have as much sex as is womanly possible.
No, I break a little bit every day. Maria, age 52. I wonder if being healthy actually means being able to adapt to our illnesses, whether physical or mental.
Yes, I do. But at age 61, I feel that my health and good fortune are a gift I am in danger of squandering. I feel I need to earn my continued good health. This reveals the silent judgments I have made on others I have known, who have been healed.
No. And being unhealthy is not a bad thing. Arthritis, etc., makes me not healthy. Unhealthy is seen as bad by society due to lack of knowledge.
Okay, I will stop here, but I just wanted to share, and you can continue listening at another time, these voices, because yeah, they did really feel comfortable in the space to be able to share their own life experiences and talents and notions of normative healthy lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Barbara. That was really lovely. Just a reminder, if you have questions, please certainly put them in the chat and we'll make sure to get to all of them. At the end, we have one more speaker, Amanda Caccia. Amanda, take it away.
Thanks so much, Emily, and thanks for the introduction. And thank you to the entire Forgot Museum and this Matilda and this entire event, which has been really brilliant. And it's an honor to speak here today. Before I begin my presentation, I just want to give a visual self-description. I am a short-statured white woman with brown eyes and brown medium-length curly hair. I have red-framed glasses, and I'm currently in my home office in the Woodlands, which is north of Houston, Texas. Behind me, there's several rows of bookshelves with like plants and vases and lots of books too, of course. So I'm going to, as I give my presentation today, I'm going to be reading from notes, which will be peppered with, ad hoc commentary. And I'm also going to be giving image descriptions as well. So Richard, you can go to the next slide. This image shows a black and white still from a 1995 performance by prominent disability studies scholar Carrie Sandall, held at a disability arts conference at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Sandall was a graduate student at the time and is now a major figure in the field that has become known as crypt theory, originally coined by Robert McClure. Sandall stood in the middle of the gallery donning a white medical jacket, which was covered in red graffiti, protesting how her body has been manipulated and probed by doctors. Sandall explained that the piece was an acknowledgement of her feeling that people with disabilities are always situated within a medical discourse. She said, quote, "That's why I got the lab jacket and why it's written in red to signify blood, and the fascination that people seem to have with the medical discourse of your body, as if it's always been written on your body, whether you're wearing it or not," end quote. So the image description is partially what I've explained here. It's a black and white still, and we see a white woman with short blonde hair tied back, who's in the middle of a gallery space wearing this red jacket. She's holding a cane in one hand, and then visibly we can see that she's standing inside of a white cube gallery space. We can see the ceiling with the track lights above her, and she's looking down directly at us in the frame of the video. So Sandall's work is an important part of what I call hospital aesthetics, which is work by contemporary disabled artists that demonstrates how they take health and care into their own hands and body minds, and where health politics meets contemporary disability aesthetics. Hospital Aesthetics, Rescripting Medical Images of Disability is the title for my current book project. Hospital aesthetics is defined as artwork that explores the ever subjective experience of being sick and ill, which is set apart from and outside of a clinical and therapeutic setting, and which is in opposition to the medical model of disability. Hospital aesthetics is not interested in the well-being of hospital patients vis-a-vis art therapy, but rather it wants to challenge the oppressive master narratives within the medical model of disability that philosophically believes that disability must be fixed or corrected. In doing the work of hospital aesthetics, contemporary disabled artists are contributing to a type of disability activism that can simultaneously improve mainstream bioethics and ableist museum and gallery culture. Hospital aesthetics also shows a different side to disabled bodies that attempts to undo the social and cultural impacts that the hospital has had on disabled patients, both historically and especially in the contemporary moment. So in doing this work of hospital aesthetics, I argue that contemporary disabled artists are unleashing a form of radical activism to empower themselves and the disabled and sick population, where they consider illness on their own terms and also therefore revealing the inadequacies of the medical industrial complex. So in my presentation today, I'm going to walk you through some examples of work that's been developed over the past 4 decades by contemporary disabled artists that I believe deepens our understanding of hospital aesthetics. Next slide. Riva Lear has created many self-portraits featuring candid and unflinching imagery of her nude or semi-nude body. The title of her work here, Corner Terra Incognita, alludes to the disabled body as unexplored territory. She's been a central figure in the disability movement in Chicago since the 80s, when she began painting her peers. The artist's portraits straddle a tension between the need for disabled people to be visible on a more elevated platform, whilst challenging how disabled individuals are often depicted in public settings and in popular culture within limiting and narrow tropes. The image we're looking at on the screen shows Riva Lear as a white woman, short-statured, who's standing in the corner of what appears to be a domestic space, perhaps a bedroom. There is a window to one side of her, and we can see the shadow of her nude form being cast on one side of the wall. She's standing on wooden floorboards, and she's staring back directly at the viewer. She has short brown hair and brown eyes, and we can see that there's aspects of her body that shows her disability. So Lear was in fact born with spina bifida and has had numerous surgeries throughout her life. She grew up in the 50s and 60s when disability was much more stigmatized than it was today. And through revelations of her own body, she aims to confront staring eyes whilst also showing the reality and the normalcy of difference. The nudity that is evidenced in her work, I believe, aligns most powerfully with imagery produced by feminist artists of Lear's preceding generation, namely Carolee Schneemann and Hannah Wilke. It's instructive to compare Lear's work with that of these earlier feminist artists who also used their nude bodies to confront the patriarchal gaze. However, I do firmly believe that disabled artists like Lear actually go beyond what Wilke was trying to do, because Lear's portraits advanced feminist theories that challenge the male gaze from a disabled perspective, also revealing a type of ableism. Next slide, please. In Chunshan Sandy Yee's work, the artist challenges notions of a complete body by suggesting that the body can reinvent itself through new wearable art, footwear, and other objects that she calls crib couture. Yee has been influenced by members of her family who, like her, were born with variable numbers of fingers and toes for several generations. Yee's work often revolves around memories of familial interactions that were focused on the appearance of her body. The process of making her adornments and objects taps into the artist's hidden emotions and distress when being confronted by the medical establishment and their quest to constantly fix Yi's body. So the image description, we see a pair of white legs that are wearing rubber latex boots. So that they have this kind of like rust appearance, and they look like they have big white and brown pads underneath the feet. And this person has got green toenail polish on, and it's set against a white background. So by using metals, fabrics, and found objects in combination with heavily handcraft-oriented techniques like metalwork, crochet, felt making, and sewing, the artist examines the stereotypes and values placed on so-called physical deformity and the impact on a person's well-being. So this work, as I mentioned, uses latex, but we also see cork, rubber, and thread. And she's really focusing on the reconfiguration of the wearer's body through mapping the memories of medical and surgical intervention. And I should say that this particular person's legs and feet were, this individual was a victim of an arson attack. And so the skin sustained very heavy burning and injuries from burning. And so the boots are here as a way to kind of materialize the structure and the shape of the skin in a more aesthetically beautiful form. And it's also therefore empowering for the wearer who has had to deal with the stigma of having legs that look physically atypical. Next slide. So in this work, Sanera Taylor has appropriated images from a historical medical textbook, which displays 4 photographs in a grid of a young boy who's being fitted for a prosthesis, which actually consists of 2 legs. So, you know, arguably today a prosthesis itself is not necessarily considered harmful or unwanted as an intervention on a disabled person that has either a congenital or acquired limb difference. But there were many instances where during the earlier years of prosthetic technology, where prosthetics were ill-fitting, they didn't have the same kind of mastery in the technology as they do today. So in this image, one of the images on the screen here, the boy can be seen kind of slouching off to one side, as though his body's resting precariously on these 2 mechanical legs. In another image, we can see that he's using crutches that are not even the right size for him either. And so it kind of shows that prosthetics in this instance was not necessarily an effective outcome for assisting this person, this boy, moving through his life's everyday activities. And so we might say that that might even be more applicable to children who are more easily able to adapt to life's challenges than adults. And instead, the image makes me feel uncomfortable, certainly through his discomfort, because we can see that he's actually, you know, being forced to wear these painful prosthetic devices as a way of looking normal and a way of, you know, trying to fit in. So that this kind of application was actually more harmful than helpful. And so the artist, I'll get my image description in here too. So we're looking at a page from a medical textbook. There's 4 black and white photographs, and these images of this boy in each screen. They show his prosthetic device in one, and then others of his front and his back of his body. He's not wearing a shirt. He's just wearing what looks like diapers or underwear, and he's got this this prosthetic device attached to his body in different ways. But another component that Sanera Taylor, the artist, actually implemented in this work is that she whited out the features of the boy's face. And she did that to change the meaning to become something more political, of course. So I'll read out a quote by her. She says, "By whiting out the individuals in the medical images, I'm removing disability from the gaze of medicine and pathology, while simultaneously giving back privacy to the individuals in the images." Next slide. contemporary disabled artist Dominic Quagliozzi has cystic fibrosis, and he had a double lung transplant back in 2015. Prior to having his lung transplant, he had to have many long stays in the hospital. During one particularly long stay back in 2013, he decided he would turn his hospital stay into an artist residency. And he started making different kinds of simple drawings that are an example that you can see on the screen here. There's three drawings on white paper, and they have these really kind of pared down abstract figure. The one on the left is called Piss, so as a person who is peeing. There's a big pool of yellow urine below him against a white background. The one in the middle is called Blood. So we see the same figure who's sort of lying prone, there's blood coming out of the arm in a big pool of blood above. Looks like it's floating above his body. And then in the image on the right, the same simple figure is sort of bent down at the knees with oversized, gigantic blue teardrops coming out of each side of his face. So he would, draw these kind of pared down forms because it was a response to something that I thought was really fascinating, namely that he said that when medical professionals would come into his room to, work with him and to tend to his various medical needs, oftentimes they would be, completely covered up their bodies to protect him and themselves from any airborne, illness or disease. So he would only ever see their eyes. And so he described to me that he had this very fragmented visual experience of these individuals. And he said that it only reinforced that kind of typical feeling of detachment that stems from the medical personnel encounter. So I'll read a quote. He said, "I was only seeing the people that were coming into my room from the nose up. I'm dealing with fragmented bodies and faces, and yet they're doing intimate things to me. They are measuring my blood pressure, taking my temperature, touching me, and helping me dress and undress." So these visceral experiences framed the artist's aesthetic choices. So that abstraction of this sort of pared down figure that we see really represents his inability to form any kind of detailed embodied features of his doctors and nurses. Another interesting aspect is also this emotional aspect, conveying mental and physical anguish, trauma, and bodily sensation in the drawings. But he told me that he used Purell hand sanitizer instead of water to mix his colors in these drawings, which I also thought was highly appropriate for the context in which he was working. Next slide. So after his time working on these drawings, he decided to have an opening, and he decided to use the hospital where he was staying to actually issue a press release for the opening. And the press release, in the same way that a gallery would issue a press release for an opening at the gallery, he decided to issue a press release from the hospital because people were invited to come to his hospital room to see his artwork hanging on the wall. And what I really enjoyed about Dominic's approach here was that he said, instead of listing out his entire artistic CV with his history of exhibitions and his degree, his art degree, and so on, all his qualifications, he actually provided a list for all the hospital stays he's ever had, his entire medical history, all the diseases he has, and the types of insurances that he owns. So he really felt that by doing that, he was reclaiming his identity as a sick person, but also just trying to challenge the status quo of artist, so that his identity as a patient with this really lengthy medical history is centered within gallery and exhibition ephemera, because the sick part of his identity was often ignored and was not credited or gained little traction or interest for him in the art world, just up until recently. As we know, COVID has changed a lot of that. Next slide. So this is just a quick image here now of Dominic, who's in the hospital bed. You see a white man with short cropped brown hair, wearing a white t-shirt. There's sheets on the bed, and he's engaged in talking to various people that are standing around his bed. In the background there you can see drawings, his drawings tacked to the wall during the opening, and there are other people who are sitting on a couch with a lamp nearby, a table lamp and a floor lamp and a coffee table that's kind of peppered with food and drink. And Dominic is also kind of tethered to all these kinds of medical ephemera that's keeping him healthy and alive. So the other interesting piece to the work that I thought was humorous and also conveys like this antagonism that is very common by contemporary disabled artists is that he said he enjoyed the fact that visitors coming to see him during the opening had to go through a lot of bureaucratic hoops to get to the room, that finding his hospital room was like a maze. And I'm sure many of us have had that experience when visiting a hospital. And so he said he likens that to the kind of difficulties and challenges one must negotiate in order to be validated as an artist in the art world, to go through various hoops to get to be considered as a working professional, which is also interesting to consider given the historical context of this event, thinking about outsider art and so on. Next slide. So I also, in my new book, kind of liken Dominic's work to that of Bob Flanagan and Cherie Rose. Flanagan had set up a really powerful and iconic performance called Visiting Hours at the Santa Monica Museum of Art back in the 90s. Flanagan also had cystic fibrosis, and Dominic acknowledges that Flanagan's work is really critically important to his practice, because Flanagan, of course, was very theatrical and very open about his experience as a sick person. Flanagan, like Dominic, was also very aware of the tropes of the hospital and the hospital bed, and how this kind of the bed especially kind of puts a patient into a position of submission and vulnerability, and that they have to kind of wait and endure this sort of treatment, a role that's very far from being active and far from being empowered. So both Dominic and Flanagan are really trying to empower and have more control over themselves and their bodies, within this sort of strict confines of being a patient. Next slide. So another part, I'm spending a lot of time on Dominic because I really like the evolution of his work. And indeed, as part of his time in hospital, he eventually turned to the hospital gown itself and realized that it was an important repository for all of his physical materials, the materiality of his physical experience in the space, whether it was through blood or urine or mucus or whatever it was, and he thought he would use that as a canvas, and he did that using it as a canvas initially, but then it eventually turned into what we're looking at here on this screen, which is Dominic, who's standing in the middle of a white space wearing a hospital gown that's been reconstituted into a business suit, and he's wearing a white shirt underneath the suit, and he's wearing black framed glasses, and he has a goatee, and there's one hand in his pocket, and he's wearing black shoes. So for him, the gown is this physical and emotional residue of bodies and also transformational moments. And he felt like the hospital gown is also a kind of this paradoxical material, because on the one hand it represents it's a security blanket, it's this thin layer of material that is only thing between you and the doctors oftentimes, but then it also is threatening because it kind of promises exposure, right, especially through that cut in the back of the gown, and maybe what is to come with these probing medical apparatuses. So I enjoyed though when he turned it into this gown, because he said that as a lung transplant recipient that he's often invited to hospital conferences and related medical events where he's invited to speak on his experiences as a double lung transplant recipient. And so he said he wears that hospital suit deliberately to give these talks to kind of disrupt the psychology of the gown as a uniform of sickness, and instead subvert that into one of power and rebellion and reclamation, similar to what Flanagan was trying to do with the hospital bed. Next slide. And now we see that Dominic has transferred the hospital gown into what he calls these transformers, which are hung up on the wall in a gallery space, and you can come and open up what he calls their fingers. You can open and close them, and like the center of the canvas also represents like a chest cavity. And this idea of opening the fingers is like also like cutting up the chest, sort of evocative of his experience as a lung transplant recipient, and trying to reclaim some kind of empowerment over what he felt was an incredibly invasive and yet, of course, life-saving procedure that he has sort of really mixed, complex emotions about. Next slide. I'm almost done, just to give you the timekeeping. So this is called Pain Scale by Carolyn Lazard. It's a vinyl wall installation of 6 black smiley faces. It's just on this plain white wall in the middle of a gallery space. So the pain scale at first may seem like this standard pain scale that medical staff hand out when one is checking into the doctor's office. And I know I've done these many a time, that you have to rate your level of pain from 1 to 5. So like 1 being no pain and then 5 being the most pain, for example. But then what Lazard has done was that all of the faces here are all smiling. So we don't see a face that is frowning for being in the most pain. And so why are they therefore all just smiling? And also the faces are notably black here. When you go into an office, the faces aren't necessarily attributed to any racial designation, or they're white. So Carolyn is making a comment on how Black bodies are not meant to feel pain because Black people and their pain is dismissed and disqualified. And Carolyn talks often about how there are countless articles and publications that point out the inequities that Black patients confront with doctors when they're recounting the battles that they face with their bodies. And they might have pain medication requests that are rejected, or the level of care they might receive might be subsidiary or secondary to white patients who might have exactly the same symptoms. So in essence, overwhelmingly, they're denied adequate pain management. And so Carolyn was meant to suggest there that through all of the smiling white faces, this is like an illusion of how we assume that this is the experience of Black patients. So last slide. This book has been really influential to me owing to this conference, and I think this is probably a nice way to wrap up the panel, is because I was happy to hear from Camille yesterday in a panel. And I've really enjoyed reading Disalienation by Camille Robsas, because, you know, there's this kind of, I find that this important account, this theoretical and practical branches of hospital aesthetics that I've been highlighting today in my talk has a really strong and clear historical precedent within St. Alban and Tuscallis. So this means in my mind that clearly there was historically a change, a desire for change and transformation within older forms of clinical practice beyond aesthetics in the world of art. And specific case studies like St. Alban show that the institution of the hospital and its medical practitioners have recognized the limitations of neutrality and objectification in medical education and all its applications. And yet these applications have yet to be, or these limitations rather, have yet to be fully and consistently absorbed into the hospital, so that real transformation can take place. And I heard something that Alison Moorhead said earlier in the previous panel today about what we're looking for is how can this be changed? And by looking at the vast majority of contemporary disabled artists who have a discontent with the medical industry, I wonder how much has changed and why we can't have a more broader implementation of these changes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That was wonderful. I have a lot of thoughts and questions, but I'll try to keep it somewhat brief so that we can have time for questions from the audience, and perhaps panelists have questions for one another. I'm going to do a little threading together of some themes I noticed across your presentations, and then I kind of have two main questions. So something I think that all of your presentations showed directly and indirectly is the kind of temporality and the affect of illness and disability, which, you know, in movies and TV often gets presented as this kind of like rupture or this tragedy or this interruption of normal life. But as it's actually lived, sickness can be kind of like boring and quotidian. Like Amanda, you showed us an artist in the hospital who described having a shortage of materials, but an abundance of time. And you also talked about the bureaucratic hoops. And this is very much part of behind the idea of occupation that Suzanne, you talked about. And Barbara, you talked about building an asylum of one's own. And yeah, most things are just lived one day at a time. And I think these presentations all show that. Okay, I have a little bit of a preface toward my first question. So, and this is something you all touched on and that I've been thinking about a lot for myself. So something that the exhibition at the Folk Art Museum, but also the most recent Venice Biennale that just opened, was on the one hand, it's like encouraging to see disabled people framed as worthy as learning from, as exciting creators. And on the other hand, I found myself also thinking about the ways that Art Brut kind of echoes the modernist obsession with the primitive, I'm using scare quotes, which in some ways was born out of an appreciation of African art, but it was also exoticizing and othering and extractive at the same time, right? In the wall label in the exhibition, there's a quote from Dubuffet writing that he was seeking out works that were, quote, uncontaminated by artistic culture, end quote. But we know, especially from some of the artists we just looked at, that being cultured and being disabled, right, that's a false binary. And we just saw plenty of work by quote unquote insider artists who were disabled. And that's not a new like identity politics thing, right? Van Gogh, or Suzanne, you've written about Agnes Martin, like disabled artists are very much part of the canon. So I think that's something that's really important to underscore, and that was implicit in all of this, is that disability arts doesn't just happen in asylums, right? It happens in the canon as well. I mean, Monet was practically blind for a lot of his best works, and I don't think those works are about overcoming the obstacle that is blindness. Like blindness helped produce that artistic, I don't know, genius. I'm using scare quotes again. And yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this show last year, the Americas Society, of an artist named Bispo do Rosario called All Existing Materials on Earth, which was full of some pretty amazing objects that Bispo, a Brazilian man with paranoid schizophrenia, made while institutionalized in Brazil in the 20th century. And he experienced hallucinations and created rather compulsively. And as I understand from the work of the art historian Kyra Cabañas, who I know spoke in another panel yesterday that I was very sorry to miss, and I hope I'm not rehashing too much of what she said, but in Brazil, there were a lot of debates right over the ethics of framing work by psychiatric patients as quote unquote art, and Bispo was one of them. At Art in America, we ran a review of that show by the art historian Elise Chagas, and she argued that the show like overrid the way that Bispo thought of himself, and also denied him a kind of privacy that he didn't get to receive in his lifetime either. And when people did try to frame his work as art while he was still alive, he would insist, I simply do this because I'm obliged, which is a great line. And yet after he died, right, a critic and curator effectively made him an artist anyway. Yeah, and so of course, I don't think any art historian would say that the artist should have the final word as to how their work is interpreted and what it means. But I do think you all sort of touched on the question of who benefits from this framing. And as I wrote during the most reviewing Venice this year, which just opened and it's brimming with outsider artists and Art Brut, I was asking, who benefits the most from their subsumption into the art world, the maker and their heirs and their community, or art dealers and or liberals looking to learn about diverse experiences? That question is very case by case and often a catch-22. We know that for SDA, one of the artists included in the Folk Art Museum show, quote, was very happy and flattered to know that some of his works will be exhibited in Paris, end quote. But I'm wondering, as you work on these topics, what are some strategies that you've found or methods as critics what are some methods and strategies you've used as curators and historians to make sure that the disabled artists you're writing about and working with, have agency and autonomy and get to tell their own stories, that the relationship isn't extractive? And I know this is probably really hard with artists who are no longer alive, where the record is scant, when institutionalized people had so few opportunities to voice what they wanted, and when, often frankly disabled people aren't seen as capable of narrating themselves and then not given the chances to do so. So yeah, methods and strategies for navigating that tricky question of quote unquote inclusion.
I can start, as I say, I just came back from the Venice Biennale.
Perfect.
And I've been actually thinking a lot about it, and I very much agree with what you say. Yeah, it was really interesting, right? It was, so the Adriana Pedrosa, the artistic director, his statement, and it was very much a strong statement, was to include artists from the Global South, artists that have not shown in Venice before. If they were not from the Global South, there would be migrants, so Italian artists that were migrants, and what we could call outsider artists, and also indigenous artists. So it was like broader scope of inclusion you could think in terms of like health experiences and background and geography, religion, identity, and so on. But what was really like problematic, and it's really interesting to think about it, is that the spaces couldn't be they were not accessible. There were not benches to sit down. There were far too many works on the walls. These artists who are perhaps being presented in that gigantic scale for many Western audiences were not left discursive space, which they need to breathe, to explain themselves, and not to be flattened. So I thought that was like quite interesting, that you use conventional structures for display, traditional structures for display, like a salon style of paintings, and you are presenting all these bodies that have gone through different types of struggle, but you're not thinking about the bodies of the viewer. So that's really interesting, no? Like, that's why I think it's very important to think about inclusion in the research, but also in the process and the administration and in the form and in the shape, and create a space for all bodies, so most bodies. And then what you were saying about temporality, this is also this is also very relevant, because I think that's one of the main issues, at least when my experience working at Wellcome, working with artists that were disabled, working artists with chronic conditions, but also working with artists that just became parents, working with artists that were burned out, that they were having anxiety during the pandemic. Like, it's not the healthy and the sick, no, everything is much more blurred together. And it was a question of time and temporality. And the main issue with institutions is time. They establish this productive time that doesn't fit the productive, like normative, standardized, artificial time, which is the way we live. That doesn't fit another way of understanding time. And you were talking about illness is not something that just in most cases, it doesn't happen suddenly. And it's the idea of crib time, which is a very kind of interesting, crib time is another concept, another way of seeing it as a term that celebrates that time is not uniform. So a lot of the work that we were doing when I was at Wellcome and with the producers was basically talking about time. like schedules and administration and bureaucracy, because without that kind of like other ways of working in terms of the temporality of putting together a project, then the collaboration with the artists that could be struggling for many different ways, it's extremely challenging, and it can be abusive. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. I completely agree.
I'm happy to jump in, kind of more from the perspective of the histories I'm trying to work to tell. And I'm really struck by and appreciate your question about this, you know, how does one do this without kind of recapitulating the extractive logic of some of what has happened in the past, and in particular in relation to histories of medicine, which have so often kind of followed the course of speaking from positions of power, whether it's a doctor or caretaker, because there are records, but not only because there are records, obviously. But I think what I've kind of been thinking a lot about, and I gestured to this a little bit in some of what I was presenting today, this all comes from my book and process, which you generously mentioned in the introduction, but there are many actors or protagonists in the narrative of kind of the history of occupational and art therapy as it intersects with aesthetic modernism in the US that I'm telling, where the patients become caregivers. And so they're not, it's not an either or. I mean, my whole story kind of spins out from Jane Addams, who famously wished to be a doctor, and her father initially didn't allow her to pursue medical training. She used her inheritance after his death to start medical school, which she never finished. But I have a whole reading of her as perpetually kind of chronically ill in ways that impacted very directly the kind of care work that she was structuring, and how she kind of thought about the multivalent roles that she was able to kind of facilitate within Hull House and other kind of sites of work and labor, but also the problem there being that I think there's a question ultimately, which I'm also very interested in whether it ultimately is merely ameliorative, because the work that she's seeking and a lot of her colleagues are seeking to produce is not necessarily a transformation of the structures, but rather the person's capacity to endure them. But at any rate, to this question of kind of how do we tell these histories, I'm trying to also think about what it means to understand this work as kind of categories of objects that were produced also for the purposes of propaganda by institutions of professionalizing societies, and thinking of this from a sociological perspective also as kind of competing forms of professionalization within the same period. And so kind of claims for competence, whether through diagnosis or visual interpretation, which is another way of saying connoisseurship, or kind of who claims access to these materials, who claims access in the case study that I presented today for art education, who has the capacity to deliver or receive instruction. But it also is really tricky when the voices that remain or could remain, there's not really textual sources to talk about what this work yielded on the level of a particular individual or even patient population or client base. And a lot of the work actually doesn't survive. And something I've been thinking about a lot more in terms of art therapy work instead of occupational therapy work. But a lot of it still does reside in medical folders, which are subject in the US to HIPAA and other forms of kind of legal oversight. So when they do exist in archives, they're often in archives of art therapists who retain the private property of people they worked with. And in often, or many cases, like we're trying actually to act on the side of privacy and keep these objects safe. And that raises a whole other set of questions in terms of subsequent acts of redaction or post-supervisory interventions into work as ways to potentially deliver these objects to posterity safely. But that's also an anonymizing function that then removes agency once again from the initial maker. So these are just a set of kind of responses to your really generous prompt that are things I guess I'm thinking about in various ways in this kind of sprawling project I'm attempting to wrangle.
Yeah, that's such a methodologically interesting, but I imagine very tricky set of variables to navigate. Thank you for sharing that.
I guess I can respond by that to that question, Emily, by saying that that's something that I constantly wrestle with. And even though I'm working with contemporary disabled artists where I have easier access to using that word again, to ensuring that they have agency, which I think that they do through, extensive interviews that I conduct with them, through all the exhibitions I curate with them, to listening carefully to their comments and to their criticisms as well. But even beyond that, I think for me in future work, and this is interesting again in this context of the Folk Art Museum, because I've constantly wondered how to be a curator and an art historian that best represents the voices of intellectual artists with intellectual and mental disabilities who might not literally have a voice. So, and how do I set myself apart from all of these other, you use the word extractive, professional groups that, and even other curators, to be frank, that have a way of displaying their work, but in ways that make me feel uncomfortable as a person who identifies as disabled. So I'm yet to really figure out and understand how to do that, and that's something that probably will be my third book project, I would say, that I'm really keen to explore, but also like kind of wondering, and we are, not to point fingers at the Folk Art Museum because this is the institution that is hosting us, but like if this institution too thinks about those quandaries, right, how to represent that voice within these kinds of institutions that are purposefully set up to honor and I guess not just to honor but to give them a platform, right? So but to be able to have a critique, an institutional critique of those structures as well, I think would be really beneficial and important moving forward.
Yeah, I will say I've always kind of felt, as someone with little expertise and as a non-historian, a little like just skeptical of a lot that happened in our group. But this exhibition really opened my mind to some of the ways these questions were being navigated historically, which I was really grateful for. So my second question, I was really moved also by how the exhibition, laid out Toscalis' really like collective and social and Marxist approach to thinking about disability, right, as something that's, in large part socially produced, and that has a lot of echoes with what a lot of people involved in disability justice are saying today as well. I think a lot about Nora Ellen Gross's book, Everyone Here Spoke Sign Language, Hereditary Deafness on Martha's Vineyard, which argues that since deafness in the population indigenous to Martha's Vineyard was so common, to be disabled there was not to be deaf, but to be unable to sign, right? That's what would exclude you from social life. And yeah, there was a quote from Toscalis that came up a few times about like we need to heal institutions as well, which I really appreciated. Also the wall text toward the end of the exhibition come around to reminding us that, in contemporary American life, neoliberalism has reframed disability as a personal problem. Like we've kind of moved away from this social model in many aspects of, medical and legal life. Right, the reason George H.W. Bush signed the ADA was to get disabled people off of welfare and back into the workplace, which I have pretty complicated feelings about that I can get into if we go there. And like we saw in Suzanne's presentation about how so much support from disability in the US today really does come from the military. So I want to ask you all how the social model, or this kind of this social model of disability comes up in your work, if it does. And I'll just answer briefly from my point of view, is that I think there's often like an impulse to focus on things like empowerment and rights, because of that's the context that we have to advocate for ourselves within in disability arts. But what I'm really struck by is a lot of like trans disability solidarity, meaning it's not only deaf artists who make work about captions, and it's not only epileptic artists making work about strobes. There's this idea that we all have to advocate for each other's access needs, and there's an interdependence there, and there's a politics to that. And this is also like as an aesthetic strategy, a way to get around the kind of confessional mode or diagnostic or medical framework that the disability can, I don't know, trapped in feels like an overstatement, but those things crop up a lot. So yeah, how does that social model come up for you in your work?
I can go again, and yeah, I mean the social model. I mean it's quite interesting the way the Wellcome operates curatorially in terms of moving forward with best practice or better practice. So the way we operated, and they still operate, is to use the research of the exhibition to kind of improve guidelines for the next exhibition. So if we did an exhibition that has to do with environmental challenges, then we did a lot of research on designing spaces where the carbon footprint wouldn't be so high, and then that research will be used for the next exhibition and so on. And with the current permanent collection, it was based on the social model of disability, and that informed how we work in other temporary exhibitions. So for me, and maybe it transpired in the Bedlam of Misbehaving presentations I did. On the one hand, is if you're working with historical collections, to look at the gaps of those collections. So yeah, Wellcome collection being a medical collection, most of the voices that you will find will be those of the doctors and also some of the patients, but not so well represented. So look for the gaps in the archives and not try to necessarily fill them, but actually present the archives with their voids, even if the story is incomplete, so people can understand why these gaps are there. Another strategy will be to present the structural, how to say, how health is structural, how illness is structural. Not, you were talking about the social model, not to put the burden in the individual, but to give a lot of context. And for that, my strategy was, if we were doing something like Joe Spence and Orit Ashery, and Joe Spence obviously is a first-person account of cancer diagnosis, but then we will conceive the space with people that are cancer patients, so we will write the text with nurses, you know, like that kind of model of collaborative shaping an exhibition through and with the voices of people that have those experiences of whatever is the topic. In this case was cancer for Joe Spence. And then also to try to fill the gaps in the collection. So if you gather material for an exhibition, so acquire Joe Spence work, so they complement the patient, the doctor gaze in the collection with Joe Spence's gaze, or those voices that I play at the end. No? You have the voices of people talking about their health, and then they become part of the collection. So yes, you expose the gaps, but then you do what you can through the development of new content to bring them back into the collection, so it becomes more balanced for future curators. But this is ongoing. It's never, like it's a taxonomic reparation. It's ongoing work. It's never over.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that.
I'm happy to jump in. I guess I would kind of echo something, Amanda, you said really kind of in passing, but the reference to COVID as something that changes the nature of how there's a broader understanding around some of these issues. And I guess as a kind of way of working in the historical materials, again, I feel like I also work in other ways, but I guess today I'm kind of standing in as like me as historian. But I think these moments of rupture at population scale and the transformations of understanding around issues of ability and all kinds of issues that can never but be one person and cannot be understood apart from the structural conditions that are so causally, like, just, I mean, they're right at the surface. I'm really drawn to these kinds of moments in the writing of these narratives, because I think they are moments where these terms and the lives behind the terms are really reimagined, and it has to be done with some understanding that is sociological, because if you're dealing with the aftermath of war or pandemic, or in the case of the Depression, I mean, insolvency at population scale, the kind of reorganization is policy, it's many things, but it can never be located only in or consequential to an individual body. And so I guess I'm using these moments where these kind of ideologies that produce the illusion of normativity are shown to be just absolutely not just untenable, but unjust. And the transformation, it has to be also thought at a scale that is broader than kind of an individual narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that.
Just a really quick note to say that the social model of disability is the model that I've been operating under for probably like over a decade, since I was introduced to disability, both on a personal and also like, you know, professional level through my writing and my working with artists. And I feel like a lot of the artists I work with also identify with the social model, but also to say that there's many other models that are have been emerging in the last few, you know, years that have also been incredibly useful. Like I mentioned crip theory in my talk, which I think is like become more of an expansive and I hesitate to use the word appropriate, but like a word that's more people, I guess, have been drawn to. And then also just to plug a new book, Disability Worlds by Faye Ginsberg and Raina Rapp. And so I really enjoy their crafting of this sort of idea of disability worlds, which obviously centers disability within that world, and really talks about how disability consciousness is all around us and is within everyday politics and practices. And that's kind of what you said earlier, Emily, just about how disability has always been a part of the canon. It's just about how we articulate and frame that within the canon.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Are there any questions from the audience? We have just a few minutes left. There's also a little space if the panelists have questions for one another.
We have a very quiet audience now. But I would like to thank you all, because it was really illuminating, and also you know, crossed so much with what was discussed yesterday and this morning, and really plugged it into our present and our moment. So I want to thank you. I see that Tom Mitchell has a question.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
WJT is asking, is there a curatorial form of madness? I love that question. My short answer is I reviewed an exhibition called Delirious at the Met. This feels like so long ago, but I know it wasn't. And my kind of, Delirious, Art at the Limits of Reason, 1950 to 1980. And my kind of critique was that I wish it had been a little more deliriously curated. I was surprised at how, for lack of a better word, normative it felt given the topic. I'll post the link to that exhibition. Thank you for your question. Do the other panelists have responses?
Especially as curators. Not yet.
I mean, I kind of have an answer, but I also feel like maybe it's, you know, it all kind of revolves around the definition of madness, clearly, right? And so, but I sometimes have felt like personally as like a mad curator because of just, you know, working outside of, you know, like this whole outsider insider conversation is so maddening, firstly, and then just being sort of purposefully working within that space of madness, like taking on work that has so much historical baggage. Been what's the word? I don't know. I feel like there's been an element of bravery and foolishness. But now it's like starting to pay off because more people are interested in the topic. And like for me, like somebody else, I think it was Suzanne, said that this experience with this exhibition has been really, or maybe sorry, it was Emily, to say that this exhibition has been really eye-opening for me, just to learn more about historically that there's some other really important historical work that has gone on, which is why I mentioned, oh, actually there's more of an affinity in the past with what contemporary disabled artists are doing now than I realized, and that's really exciting to me. So sorry, that's a long-winded answer to your question, but
that's actually amazing that that's exactly what the exhibition wants to do, and also bringing you also together for this symposium was really to try to present connections, but also confrontations. And I think you mentioned also the context of this invitation and the museum. And I think that's something also as a museum dedicated to self-taught art and folk artists. Of course, we are thinking about this categorization and the extractive nature of some of the notions that have been used, and also to historicize them, which was also what happened this morning. We talked a lot about art brut as an historical notion, and the need to historicize it. With Chiara Cabañas, Valérie Rousseau, and Raphael Koning. I think we are going to close this program, except if you have any urgencies to add something. But I would like to thank you, the four of you, for this really wonderful program.